Get ready for an adventure. Sarah and John find themselves in a creepy clearing and realize Desperation Road has some serious secrets. Ready for a wild ride on a cold, moonless night, Sarah and John decided to take a shortcut to reach a small, isolated town where they planned to spend the weekend. The road was known as Desperation Road by a few locals. They ignored the villagers' warnings and pressed on, wanting to save time. The car moved slowly along the winding paths of the deserted road. Around them, only shadows stretched out. The only light came from the headlights, which seemed to struggle against the darkness. John drove, keeping his eyes on the road, while Sarah looked uneasily out the window, feeling a weird presence in the air. The silence was creepy, broken only by the sound of the tires on the bumpy road. "Are you sure this is the way?" Sarah asked, trying to hide her growing unease. John nodded, though he looked a bit unsure. "The GPS says we're on the right track." As they continued, things started to change. It got really cold in the car, making Sarah shiver even though she was dressed warmly. Fog started to swirl around the car, appearing out of nowhere. Suddenly, John saw something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road. "Did you see that?" he said, his voice shaking. Sarah looked ahead, but the figure had already disappeared. "What was it?" "I didn't see anything." The discomfort grew, like invisible hands squeezing their hearts. With every mile, the road became more oppressive, like it was alive, suffocating them with its silence. John increased the speed, wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. But the faster he went, the more the road seemed to stretch infinitely. Then, a scream. A sharp, desperate scream cut through the night, coming from outside the car. Sarah covered her ears, trying to muffle the sound that seemed to come from all directions. "Let's get out of here," she screamed at John, but he was already stepping on the gas. Their eyes were wide with fear, and the road ahead seemed distorted, a dark tunnel leading them deeper into a nightmare. As Sarah and John sped down the road, the atmosphere seemed to tighten its grip around them. The shadows grew darker, and the air became thick with unexplainable dread. They exchanged nervous glances, their fear reflecting in each other's eyes. Suddenly, the car jolted violently, followed by an ominous grinding sound. John tried to regain control as the car came to a shuddering halt. Smoke billowed from the hood, wrapping the couple in an eerie haze. They stepped out of the car, their hearts pounding. The silence was suffocating. The wind's wail was replaced by unsettling stillness. It was as if the world around them held its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. As they looked round, Sarah's gaze was drawn to the edge of the road. Figures materialized in the fog, their forms flickering like ghosts. Shadows danced in the corner of their vision, disappearing whenever they looked directly at them. Unease settled like a lead weight in their stomachs. Who were these figures, and what did they want? Every instinct screamed at them to run, but they were trapped, unable to escape from this weird place. A soft, haunting voice whispered through the air, barely audible. "You should have listened. There is no escape from Desperation Road." Their hearts froze. It was the first time they had heard a voice since starting this journey. Sarah clutched John's arm, her grip tight as they stared into the void of the road ahead. A chilling realization washed over them. They were not alone. Eyes glowed in the darkness, inhuman and scary. The figures drew closer, their movements slow and deliberate. Sarah and John could feel the oppressive presence closing in round them, suffocating their thoughts, testing their resolve. With a surge of adrenaline, they turned and ran, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Shadows swirled and twisted, the road itself seeming to come alive, desperate to keep them captive. Panic clutched their hearts as they raced, not knowing what lay ahead, only fueled by the hope of escaping whatever evil lurked in the darkness. They ran for what felt like forever, until they stumbled upon an old abandoned house. Desperate and terrified, they pushed open the creaking door and huddled together inside, desperate for a break from the horrors chasing them. But little did they know, they had only begun to scratch the surface of the true terrors awaiting them on Desperation Road. Sarah and John looked round the old house, trying to find any sign of safety. The faint moonlight revealed old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs that fluttered like ghostly curtains. The walls were cold and damp, as if the house itself was silently weeping. The only sound breaking the silence was their frantic heartbeats. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the house, the creak of a door somewhere in the distance. John raised his hand, silencing Sarah, and they held their breath, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The noise repeated, louder this time, accompanied by slow, dragging footsteps. "We're not alone," John whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Sarah grabbed an old candlestick, her only makeshift weapon. They began to move carefully through the house, each step sending a shiver down their spine. As they walked, they noticed that the paintings on the walls seemed to follow them with their eyes, old figures of residents who had disappeared long ago. They reached a narrow hallway at the back of the house. A slightly open door was lit by a faint, flickering light, like a candle was about to go out. They approached and, with a sharp push, opened the door completely. Inside the room, they saw something that made them recoil. In the middle of the floor was a circle of candles round a human figure, with its back to them. The figure was murmuring something unintelligible, a creepy melody that seemed to distort reality. The air was heavy with the smell of burning wax and something else, something metallic and rusty. Blood. John felt the panic intensify while Sarah struggled to stay calm. "Who are you?" John asked, his voice trembling. The figure stopped murmuring and slowly began to rise. There was no hurry in its movements, only a deadly calm that intensified Sarah and John's terror. When the figure finally turned, revealing a pale and disfigured face, its eyes were empty, soulless. It was like looking into the abyss. "Welcome to the final destination," the figure whispered in a chilling voice that echoed in their bones. Suddenly, the floor beneath Sarah's feet began to shake. Cracks spread across the wooden floor, emitting a bright red light. The circle of candles exploded into high flames, and ethereal screams echoed through the room, like tormented souls crying for release. Sarah and John tried to run, but their legs seemed paralyzed by fear and the ground crumbling beneath them. The figure began to approach, a skeletal hand outstretched, seeming to suck the very light and warmth around it. The collapse was complete. The house was falling in on itself, and the world seemed to fold into a vortex of darkness and fire. Sarah screamed as John held her, both feeling the end was near. But deep in their hearts, a final flame of hope fought to survive, driving them to resist this endless nightmare. Sarah and John fought against the paralyzing panic and somehow managed to escape the crazy room. They ran down the narrow hallway, feeling the house collapsing round them, while ghostly screams and moans echoed through the walls. The air was filled with dust and smoke, making it hard to breathe and see. They finally found a back door and, with a desperate push, managed to open it and escape into the open air. Time seemed to have stopped. The moon was still hidden, and a thick mist covered everything. But at least they were out of that cursed house. The sounds of destruction faded as they moved away, but something dark still lingered in the air. They weren't free yet. They were still on Desperation Road, and the figure chasing them wasn't giving up. "We need to keep walking," Sarah said, panting. "We can't stop now." John nodded, and together they moved forward along the road, trying to ignore the exhaustion and the feeling of being followed. Each step felt like a monumental effort, and the road stretched infinitely ahead of them. As they walked, they started to hear whispers again, but this time they seemed louder, more insistent. The shadows round them moved with greater intensity, as if they were alive, surrounding and pulling them into the darkness. Suddenly, they saw a light in the distance, faint but comforting. It was a small chapel, old and worn, but it seemed like a beacon of hope in the vast night. They quickened their pace, running towards the light with hearts full of hope. Upon reaching the chapel's entrance, they pushed the heavy wooden door that creaked with a chilling sound. The light came from small candles ranged round a simple altar. The silence inside was deep, but somehow welcoming, a stark contrast to what they had faced so far. As they explored the interior, they noticed an old book on the altar. John carefully opened it, revealing worn and yellowed pages with ancient writings. "Maybe this will help us get out of here," John said, with a thread of hope in his voice. They began to read aloud, trying to decipher the text between the symbols and ancient runes. With each word spoken, the atmosphere inside the chapel seemed to change, as if an invisible energy was manifesting, protecting them from the outside shadows. But the shadows outside wouldn't stay still. Figures appeared at the doorway, eyes glowing with malice and hunger. Time was running out. "Sarah, keep reading. Don't stop," John shouted as the figure approached, seemingly invoked by the darkness. Sarah read faster, her voice echoing through the chapel walls. Upon reaching the final word, a bright light filled the room, forcing the shadows to retreat with screams of anguish. The glowing eyes disappeared, and deadly silence once again took over. As they exited the chapel, they noticed the road had changed. The mist had dissipated, and the horizon began to brighten with the first signs of dawn. They walked, exhausted but with a new sense of hope. Desperation Road had tried to pull them into its abyss, but Sarah and John, with courage and determination, managed to survive. The worst seemed to have passed, but the road wasn't over yet. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, Sarah and John saw a fork ahead. Desperation Road split into two paths before them, both shrouded in mystery and uncertainty. "Which way should we go?" Sarah asked John, her eyes still haunted by the harrowing experience they had just endured. John looked at the two paths, his heart heavy with indecision. "There's no way to know for sure, Sarah, but we need to choose one and keep moving. Maybe one of these roads will lead us to freedom." With cautious steps, they decided to take the left path. Each step was filled with a mix of hope and apprehension, knowing they were stepping into uncharted territory. The oppressive silence seemed to embrace them again, bringing a sense of loneliness and helplessness. As they walked, they noticed something different. The sounds of the shadows pursuing them had diminished, and the atmosphere felt lighter. The air was fresher, and the melodious song of distant birds echoed in the morning air. They exchanged hopeful glances. Maybe they were finally approaching safety. But Desperation Road still had many tricks up its sleeve. The path opened to a clearing with a small pond, where white lilies floated peacefully. It seemed like an oasis of calm amidst the chaos of Desperation Road. Sarah and John approached the crystal clear water, letting their hands touch the calm surface. A golden glow emanated from the pond, radiating a sense of serenity. For a brief moment, they felt as if they were out of reach of the terror that had followed them. However, the respite was fleeting. The shadows began to move rapidly, the trees round the pond contorting and moving as if they had a life of their own. "What is happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with fear. John grabbed Sarah's hand, his expression determined despite the panic within him. "We have to stick together and fight whatever comes our way, Sarah. We can do this." As the trees closed in, extending twisted branches towards them, Sarah and John faced the next ordeal of Desperation Road. The battle for survival was far from over. Don't miss the next chapter of this electrifying horror saga. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like to catch every detail of what's going to happen to Sarah and John.